On Christmas Eve in 1971, a 17-year-old girl boarded a flight over the Amazon rainforest. A few hours later, she would be the only survivor. Not the only survivor of a crash. The only survivor of a plane that literally broke apart in midair. And somehow, that wasn't even the craziest part of the story. Because after falling from the sky, she woke up alone in one of the most dangerous environments on Earth. Injured, lost, surrounded by hundreds of miles of rainforest. And instead of being rescued, she would spend the next 11 days trying to survive. Her name was Julianne Koepke, and her story sounds less like real life and more like something somebody would reject from a movie script for being unrealistic. Yet every major part of it actually happened. Julianne grew up differently than most children. Her parents were scientists. They spent much of their lives studying wildlife deep inside the Peruvian rainforest. While most children were learning about nature from books, Julianne was experiencing it firsthand. She knew the jungle, its dangers, its sounds, its wildlife. At the time, she had no idea those lessons would eventually save her life. On December 24th, 1971, Julianne and her mother boarded LANSA Flight 508. Their destination was Pucallpa, Peru. They were heading home for Christmas. The flight wasn't unusual. Passengers settled into their seats. Families talked quietly. People looked out the windows. Some dozed off. Others read magazines. Just another flight. Nothing seemed wrong. For most of the journey, everything was normal. Then the weather started changing. At first, passengers noticed dark clouds forming outside. Then turbulence. Nothing severe, just enough to make people grip their armrests. The aircraft continued onward. Unfortunately, it was heading directly into a powerful storm. The shaking became worse. Then worse again. Lightning flashed outside the windows. Rain slammed against the aircraft. Passengers began looking nervous. Flight attendants tried reassuring people. The pilots continued forward. Then disaster struck. A bolt of lightning hit the plane, directly. Witnesses who survived only briefly after the crash described seeing a bright flash. Inside the aircraft, chaos erupted. Passengers screamed. The plane violently lurched. And then something almost unimaginable happened. The aircraft began breaking apart in midair. The right wing separated. The fuselage started tearing open. Rows of seats were ripped loose. Pieces of the aircraft were suddenly falling through the sky, including Julianne. One moment she was sitting beside her mother. The next, she wasn't inside a plane anymore. She was falling, still strapped into her seat, thousands of feet above the Amazon rainforest. Imagine realizing you're falling toward the earth. Not in a dream, not in a nightmare. Actually falling. No parachute, no control, no way to stop it. Just sky beneath you, and forest waiting below. The seat spun through the air. Clouds rotated around her. Blue sky became green forest. Green forest became blue sky. Again, and again, and again. Then everything went black. Nobody knows exactly how she survived. Even today, experts have theories. Maybe the thick rainforest canopy slowed the impact. Maybe the row of seats acted like a crude parachute. Maybe the angle of the fall was just right. Nobody knows. What they do know is that falling more than 10,000 feet should have been fatal. Yet somehow, Julianne woke up. When she opened her eyes, she was lying on the forest floor. Alone. Her glasses were missing. One eye was swollen nearly shut. Her collarbone was broken. She had a concussion. Cuts covered her body, but she was alive. At first, she couldn't fully understand what had happened. The crash felt unreal, like a dream. She called for her mother. No answer. She listened. Nothing. Just rainforest sounds. People who have never been in the Amazon often imagine silence. The reality is the exact opposite. The rainforest never stops making noise. Insects, birds, Animals moving through the vegetation, branches snapping, buzzing, rustling, calls echoing through the trees. Everything feels alive, especially when you're completely alone. Julianne started looking for other survivors. Surely someone else had survived. There had been dozens of passengers. There had to be somebody, anyone. Instead, she found wreckage, scattered debris, broken pieces of the aircraft, seats, luggage, and eventually, bodies. The reality of the situation became impossible to ignore. She wasn't waiting for rescue beside a crash site. She was stranded deep inside the Amazon, possibly hundreds of miles from help. Most people would have panicked. Many probably would have stayed put. But Julianne remembered something her father had taught her. A simple survival rule. If you're lost in a rainforest, follow water. Streams lead to larger streams. Larger streams lead to rivers. And rivers eventually lead to people. So she began searching for water. Eventually she found a small stream. Not much, just enough. Then she started following it. That decision probably saved her life, because rescue teams were searching enormous areas of rainforest. The jungle canopy was so dense that aircraft couldn't easily see survivors below. Even when planes passed overhead, they often couldn't see anything, including Julianne. Day after day, she continued walking. The rainforest punished her constantly. The heat was brutal. The humidity was relentless. Insects covered her body. Mosquitoes swarmed around her. The cuts from the crash became infected. Food was scarce. Clean water wasn't guaranteed. Every step hurt. And every night brought a new challenge. Darkness. The Amazon after sunset is terrifying. Visibility disappears. Sounds become louder. Every rustle feels threatening. Every movement in the bushes feels dangerous. And Julianne was sleeping alone, injured, without protection. One of the most disturbing moments came several days into her journey. She noticed something unusual inside one of her wounds. At first, she thought it was dirt. Then she looked closer. Maggots. The infection had become severe enough that insects had laid eggs inside the wound. Most people would have been horrified. Julianne was horrified, but she kept moving, because stopping wasn't an option. As the days passed, exhaustion began taking over. The jungle looked the same everywhere. Trees, water, mud, more trees. It would have been incredibly easy to lose hope. Yet she continued following the stream, hour after hour, day after day. Then came one of the hardest parts. She started hearing aircraft. Occasionally, a distant engine would echo above the trees. Search planes, rescue aircraft, help, somewhere overhead. Julianne would stop, listen, hope. Maybe this time they'd see her. Maybe this time it would be over. Then the sound would fade. The aircraft would disappear, and she'd still be alone. Imagine how crushing that must have felt, knowing help was nearby, yet completely unable to reach it. By the 10th day, she was running out of energy. She had been walking through the Amazon for more than a week. Injured, exhausted, dehydrated, completely alone. Most survival stories end before this point. This one didn't. Because on the 11th day, something changed. She found a boat. At first, she thought she might be hallucinating. A real boat, tied beside a small clearing. Evidence of people, actual people. Nearby stood a small shelter used by local workers. Nobody was there at the moment, but somebody had clearly been there recently. For the first time in 11 days, Julianne knew she wasn't alone. Eventually, the workers returned, and what they saw must have been unbelievable. A teenage girl emerging from the rainforest, covered in cuts, dirty, exhausted, barely able to stand, claiming she'd fallen from an airplane. If someone told you that story today, you probably wouldn't believe them. Neither did some of the workers at first, but it was true, every word. They helped her, treated her injuries, fed her, and eventually got her transported to safety. 11 days after falling from the sky, she had survived. But there was one final revelation waiting for her, a revelation that somehow made the entire story even more shocking. She wasn't one of several survivors. She wasn't one of a handful. She wasn't one of two. She was the only one. 92 people had been aboard Flight 508. 91 on the morning of April 26, 2003, Aron Ralston went hiking alone in the Utah desert. He was 27 years old. He was an experienced climber and outdoorsman, and Blue John Canyon wasn't supposed to be some enormous expedition. It was supposed to be a day trip, a few hours in the canyon, some climbing, then home. There was just one problem. Aron hadn't told anybody where he was going. He didn't leave an itinerary. He didn't tell a friend which canyon he was entering, and he didn't have a phone that could get him out of trouble. At the time, none of that seemed particularly important. He'd done things like this before. He knew what he was doing, and he expected to be back before anybody even had a reason to wonder where he was. That decision would eventually become one of the most important details of his entire story, because by the time anybody knew he was missing, Aron would already have spent days trapped underground, and he would have made a decision that most people can't even imagine making. He entered Blue John Canyon that afternoon. The landscape was beautiful. Red sandstone, narrow passages, steep walls, the kind of place that looks almost completely untouched by civilization. Aron moved through the canyon carefully, climbing and lowering himself through sections of rock. At one point, he reached a narrow section where a large boulder was wedged between the canyon walls. He'd encountered rocks like this before. It didn't look particularly dangerous, so he used it for support as he climbed down. Then the boulder moved. Aron felt it shift. For a fraction of a second, he probably thought he could get away from it. He couldn't. The boulder came loose. It dropped, and his right arm was caught between the rock and the canyon wall. The pain was immediate, but the first thing Aron apparently did wasn't scream. He tried to move the rock. He pushed against it, pulled, changed his position, tried again. Nothing. The boulder weighed around 800 pounds. It wasn't going anywhere. That's when the reality of his situation started sinking in. He was alone. He was trapped, and nobody knew where he was. Aron began shouting for help. The sound echoed through the canyon. He waited. Nothing. He shouted again. Still nothing. And eventually, the sound of his own voice disappearing into the canyon became terrifying. There was nobody coming. He started working on the boulder. He had a small multi-tool with him, including a knife. So he tried chipping away at the rock around his trapped hand. It was painfully slow. He kept working. Small pieces. Tiny pieces. Anything that might create enough room to pull his arm free. But the boulder wasn't going anywhere. And there was another problem. His supplies were limited. He had some food. He had water. But he hadn't planned on spending the night in the canyon. He certainly hadn't planned on spending several nights there. As the first day passed, Aron kept looking for a solution. He tried using climbing equipment to create leverage. He built a pulley system using rope and his gear. If he could somehow move the boulder even slightly, maybe that would be enough. It wasn't. The rock barely moved. The rope stretched. The system couldn't generate enough force. And eventually, Aron had to accept something he really didn't want to accept. The boulder was stronger than he was. Night came. Temperatures dropped. The canyon became dark. Aron was still trapped, and nobody knew where he was. The next morning, he started again. More attempts to move the boulder. More attempts to chip around it. More attempts to find some angle or technique he missed. He was an engineer. He was used to solving problems. So he treated the boulder like a problem that simply hadn't been solved yet. But this wasn't a machine. There wasn't a correct button to press. There wasn't another tool hidden somewhere. And every hour that passed made the situation worse. His water was disappearing. His food was disappearing. And his trapped arm was becoming increasingly damaged. Eventually, Aaron started considering the one solution he had been trying not to think about. His arm. He had a knife. Could he cut himself free? At first, even thinking about it sounded ridiculous. The knife wasn't designed for anything like that. And there was another obvious problem. Bone. He could potentially cut through skin, maybe muscle. But how was he supposed to get through the bones of his forearm? And even if he somehow did, what would happen afterward? He'd be bleeding, severely injured, still trapped in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't really a solution. It was a choice between two terrible outcomes. Stay there and eventually die, or try something so extreme that it could kill him immediately. For the next few days, Aaron kept trying to find another answer. He rationed his remaining water. He ate his remaining food slowly. He tried to stay warm at night. He kept working on the rock, and every once in a while, he'd stop and listen. Maybe someone would appear. Maybe another hiker would come through the canyon. Maybe a rescue helicopter would pass overhead. Nothing. This is where the story becomes difficult to imagine. Because Aaron wasn't trapped for a few hours. He wasn't trapped overnight. He was trapped for days. Alone, unable to move, with one arm pinned beneath hundreds of pounds of rock. Eventually, he began recording messages for his family on a small video camera. He didn't know if anyone would ever find them, but he recorded them anyway. Messages to his parents. Messages to people he cared about. He even carved his name and what he believed was his date of death into the canyon wall. He had started accepting that he might die there. And that acceptance was strange, because once he stopped trying to convince himself that everything would somehow work out, he could think more clearly. He began looking at the situation differently. Not, how do I move the rock? But, how do I get myself out? There was one thing he hadn't tried. His arm could bend. The boulder was holding him in place. If he could break the bones, he might be able to pull himself free. The idea was horrifying, but it was also the first idea he'd had that might actually work. By this point, his body was severely dehydrated. He had almost no water left. He had become increasingly. On January 29th, 1982, a man named Stephen Callahan disappeared into the Atlantic Ocean. His boat had been destroyed during the night. He was hundreds of miles from land, and when he finally realized what had happened, there was only one thing keeping him alive: a tiny inflatable life raft. It was never supposed to last 76 days. Neither was he. Stephen Callahan was an experienced sailor and naval architect. He understood boats. He understood the ocean. And in January of 1982, he was sailing alone from the Canary Islands toward the Caribbean aboard a small 21-foot sailing boat called the Napoleon Solo. He wasn't attempting some reckless expedition. He was simply trying to cross the Atlantic. For the first several days, things went relatively well. The boat moved through the Atlantic. Stephen settled into the rhythm of sailing alone. Sleep, eat, check the boat, adjust the sails, repeat. Then, during the night of February 4th, everything changed. Stephen was asleep when the boat was suddenly hit by something. The impact was violent. The boat was damaged badly. Water began rushing inside. Stephen woke up to a situation that every sailor hopes they will never experience. His boat was sinking. He immediately went into survival mode. There wasn't time to panic. He grabbed what equipment he could: a life raft, emergency supplies, a few tools. Whatever he could reach before the boat disappeared beneath him. Then the Napoleon Solo was gone. Stephen was sitting in a tiny inflatable raft in the middle of the Atlantic. No engine, no sailboat, no reliable way to travel. Just a small orange raft surrounded by thousands of miles of ocean. And he had no idea how long he was going to be there. At first, Stephen had a reasonable expectation. Someone would find him. A boat might pass. An airplane might spot the raft. Maybe the emergency equipment would lead rescuers directly to him. He had survived the sinking. The hardest part should have been over. It wasn't. The first major problem was water. A human can't survive for weeks without food. Without fresh water, things become much more serious. Stephen had some emergency water with him, but nowhere near enough for a long stay at sea. So he had to figure out how to make more. He had a small solar still. It was designed to use sunlight to turn seawater into drinkable fresh water. It wasn't fast, it wasn't easy, but it worked. And from that point forward, his entire existence revolved around water. Collect rainwater. Use the solar still. Drink carefully. Don't waste anything. Repeat. Food was another problem. Stephen had limited supplies. Eventually, he would have to catch his own. Luckily, there were fish beneath the raft. The problem was catching them. He improvised fishing equipment from whatever he had. Line, hooks, pieces of gear, anything that could work. Eventually, he started catching fish. And this became one of the most important things he could do, because every fish meant another day. But the ocean wasn't going to make things easy. The raft was tiny, small enough that there wasn't much room to move. Every wave could throw Stephen around. The sun beat down during the day. At night, temperatures dropped. The wind could suddenly become violent. And beneath him, there was nothing. Just thousands of feet of ocean. Then came another problem. Sharks. Stephen began seeing them around the raft. At first, it was just an occasional fin. Then more. The fish he was catching attracted them. And the longer he stayed in the water, the more vulnerable he became. He couldn't simply jump into the ocean and swim around. If the raft drifted away, he'd be gone. So he had to be extremely careful. Eventually, Stephen started sleeping in the raft while sharks circled beneath him. Think about that. Every time he looked over the side, there was an enormous ocean beneath him. Every splash could attract something. Every mistake could mean falling into the water. And then, the weather changed. A storm hit. The raft was tossed around. Stephen fought to keep it from flipping. Rain hammered down. Waves crashed over him. The ocean that had already been difficult became completely hostile. And this was when one of the biggest dangers became obvious. The raft could fail. It was inflatable. It could tear. A sharp object could puncture it. A seam could fail. And if it lost enough air, Stephen would be sitting directly in the ocean. So he started repairing it constantly. He carried repair equipment. He patched holes. He checked the raft, then checked it again, and again. Eventually, the raft looked less like a new piece of survival equipment and more like something that had been repaired dozens of times. Because it had. This became his routine. Wake up, check the raft, check the weather, collect water, fish, repair something, eat, sleep, wake up, repeat. Day after day. And that's where the psychological part of survival became almost as difficult as the physical part. Stephen had nobody to talk to, nobody to ask for advice, nobody to tell him how long he had left. There was no schedule, no destination, no guarantee anyone even knew where he was. The ocean looked exactly the same in every direction. Horizon, water, sky, nothing else. Eventually, his mind started playing tricks on him. At times, he imagined things. He dreamed about being back on land. He thought about people he knew. He'd wake up and, for a moment, forget where he was. Then he'd open his eyes and remember. Still the raft, still the ocean, still alone. Weeks passed. Most people would have expected him to become weaker and weaker, and physically he did. He lost weight. His skin was damaged by constant exposure to the sun. His body became exhausted. But something else happened too. He became better at surviving. He learned exactly how much water he could drink, exactly how much food he needed, exactly how to repair the raft, exactly how to position himself during storms. The ocean had become his entire world, and he had learned how to live inside it. Then one day, Stephen saw something. A ship. He immediately tried to attract its attention. He waved, signaled, did everything he could. The ship kept going. It hadn't seen him. Imagine that moment, after weeks alone at sea, finally seeing another human being, and then watching them disappear over the horizon. Stephen had no choice but to keep going. More days, more storms, more fishing, more repairs, more nights staring at an empty horizon. At one point, the raft became so damaged that Stephen had to essentially rebuild parts of it. He kept patching holes, reinforcing weak sections, improvising repairs. The raft was slowly becoming a collection of emergency fixes, but it remained afloat. And somehow, so did he. Weeks became months. By now, Stephen had been drifting for an amount of time that would have sounded impossible when he first entered the raft. He had expected rescue, then he had expected death. Eventually, he stopped thinking in those terms. He simply thought about tomorrow. Survive today, then survive tomorrow. And then something happened that changed everything. Stephen saw land. After more than 2 months in 1945, the Second World War ended. Japan surrendered. Millions of soldiers went home. Cities that had been destroyed began rebuilding. The world moved on, but one Japanese soldier didn't. His name was Hiro Onoda, and for almost 3 decades, he remained in the jungle, convinced the war was still happening. The strangest part is that people tried to tell him. They dropped leaflets. They sent messages. They searched for him. His family tried to reach him. He saw newspapers. He saw photographs. He even encountered people who told him Japan had surrendered. He rejected all of it. To Onoda, none of it was real. He had been ordered not to surrender, and he intended to follow that order. Hiro Onoda was born in 1922 in Japan. As a young man, he joined the Japanese military, but he wasn't trained simply to fight conventional battles. He was trained in intelligence and guerrilla warfare. His job was to operate behind enemy lines, gather information, sabotage infrastructure, avoid detection, and most importantly, keep fighting. In 1944, Onoda was sent to Lubang Island in the Philippines. The island was strategically important. Japanese forces were preparing for an American invasion. Onoda was given a very specific set of instructions. He was supposed to continue his mission even if the Japanese forces on the island were defeated, and he was explicitly ordered not to surrender. That final order would shape the next 30 years of his life. American forces eventually attacked. Japanese troops were overwhelmed. The island was captured, and many Japanese soldiers were killed or surrendered. But Onoda and a small group of other soldiers disappeared into the jungle. They weren't interested in surrendering. They believed the Japanese military would eventually return. Then the war ended. But Onoda didn't know that. The Japanese government eventually realized that some soldiers might still be hiding on remote islands. So they began dropping leaflets into the jungle. The message was simple. The war is over. Japan has surrendered. Come out. Onoda found them and rejected them. He believed they were enemy propaganda. To him, the Americans were trying to trick Japanese soldiers into revealing themselves. And honestly, from his perspective, it made sense. He had been trained to expect exactly that. So he stayed. Years passed. 1946 became 1947, then 1948, then 1949. Onoda and the remaining soldiers lived in the jungle. They survived by stealing food and supplies from local farms. They moved constantly. They hid from authorities. They believed they were still fighting a war. Meanwhile, the actual war had been over for years. Japan was rebuilding. Families were returning home. The world was changing, and Onoda had no idea. Eventually, the other soldiers began disappearing. One surrendered, another was killed, another eventually died. By 1972, Onoda was alone. Think about that. At this point, he had been living in the jungle for almost 30 years. He was no longer hiding with a group. He was completely alone, and he still believed the war wasn't over. The outside world had changed beyond recognition. The Japan he remembered from 1945 barely existed anymore. But Onoda didn't know that. He continued living in the jungle. He moved between hiding places. He collected food. He maintained his weapons. He avoided authorities. And occasionally, he carried out what he believed were military operations. Local residents knew there was a Japanese soldier somewhere on the island. Search teams tried to find him, but Onoda was extremely good at disappearing. He'd been trained for exactly this. Then something happened in 1972. Another Japanese holdout was discovered. He was killed. News of his death reached Japan, and suddenly, people began asking a question. Could Onoda still be alive? The Japanese government started searching again. They sent people to Lubang. They left messages. They tried to convince him that the war had ended decades earlier. But Onoda still refused. There was one problem. He had been given orders, and the only person he trusted enough to contradict those orders was his commanding officer. So authorities searched for him, but they didn't simply send soldiers. They eventually searched for his former commander, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, the man who had originally sent Onoda to Lubang. In 1974, Taniguchi agreed to travel to the Philippines. He went to Lubang, and he personally met with Onoda. This was the moment that finally ended the war. Not because Onoda suddenly discovered the truth. Not because a newspaper convinced him. Not because a search team captured him. Because the man who had given him the original order finally gave him another one. Onoda was formally ordered to surrender. And he did. He walked out of the jungle wearing his old military uniform. He carried his sword, his rifle, and ammunition. After almost 30 years, he was finally coming home. He was 52 years old. The world he returned to was almost completely unrecognizable. When he had disappeared into the jungle, World War II was still happening. When he walked out, the war had been over for nearly 30 years. He had missed the entire transformation of Japan. He had missed the Korean War. The Vietnam War had already begun and was still happening. Humans had entered the space age. The first artificial satellites had been launched. People had landed on the moon. Television had transformed society. Cars had changed. Technology had changed. Japan itself had transformed from a devastated post-war country into a modern economic power. And Onoda had been living in the jungle. Imagine the psychological shock, walking out of the jungle expecting one world and discovering another. People crowded around him. Journalists photographed him. Television cameras followed him. He suddenly became internationally famous. The man who had spent almost 30 years believing the war was still going on had finally surrendered. But there was another strange part. Onoda wasn't treated simply as a fool. Many Japanese people viewed him as a symbol of extraordinary dedication. He had followed his orders to an almost unimaginable extreme. But his story also caused controversy, because while he was hiding in the jungle, people on Lubang had suffered. Onoda and his fellow holdouts had been involved in raids and attacks that killed and injured local residents. So his return wasn't simply a triumphant story. There were victims on the other side of it. Eventually, Onoda moved to Brazil. He lived there for years. He became a rancher. He later returned to Japan and established a survival school for children. He lived a long life, and he continued speaking about his experiences. But the strangest thing about his story isn't that he survived in the jungle. People have survived in jungles before. It's not even that he avoided capture for decades. That's remarkable, but still understandable. The strangest part is the world he missed. When Onoda entered the jungle, World War II was still being fought. When he came out, his country had rebuilt itself. The enemy he'd been fighting no longer existed. The government he thought he was serving had changed. The weapons he carried were obsolete. The world had entered an entirely different era. And yet, inside his mind, the war had never ended. For nearly 30 years, he woke up every morning believing he was still a soldier behind enemy lines. He ate what he could find. He hid from people. He watched for enemies. He waited for orders. And every day that passed reinforced the reality he'd built for himself. That's what makes hero Onoda's story so difficult to comprehend. He wasn't trapped by walls. He wasn't physically imprisoned. There was nothing stopping him from walking out. The thing keeping him in the jungle was what he believed. And that belief was strong enough to keep him there for almost 30 years. Onoda finally surrendered in 1974, but in a strange way, the war had ended for everyone else almost 3 decades earlier. He had simply never received the message he was willing to believe. Or perhaps he had received it many times. He just didn't trust any of them. And that might be the strangest part of all. The world spent decades trying to tell one man that the war was over. But the only person he trusted was the man who had originally told him to keep fighting. And when that man finally returned, Onoda walked out of the jungle after 29 years. In October of 1972, a small airplane disappeared over the Andes Mountains. Inside were 45 people. They were heading to Chile for what should have been a routine flight. A rugby team, their friends, their families, a few other passengers. Nobody on board knew that within hours, they would be fighting to stay alive in one of the most unforgiving places on Earth. The plane crashed into the mountains, but the crash itself wasn't what made this story infamous. The people who survived the impact would spend more than 2 months trapped at extreme altitude. Freezing temperatures, almost no food, no way to contact the outside world, and eventually, they would be forced to make an unimaginable decision. The flight was Fuerza Aérea Uruguaya Flight 571. It took off from Montevideo, Uruguay, on October 13, 1972. The passengers were mostly members of the Old Christians club rugby team. They were young, excited, heading toward Chile for a rugby match. The atmosphere on the plane was relaxed. People talked, joked, looked out the windows. They had no idea what was coming. As the plane crossed the Andes, the weather became difficult. Clouds surrounded the mountains. Visibility dropped. The pilots believed they had reached a point where they could begin descending. They were wrong. The aircraft descended too early, and suddenly, the mountains were directly ahead. The pilots tried to climb. They couldn't. The plane struck the mountainside. The wings were torn away. The aircraft broke apart. The fuselage slid down the mountain. And somehow, Some of the passengers survived. When the surviving passengers looked around, they were surrounded by devastation. People were injured. Some were trapped. Others were dead. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and they were sitting more than 11,000 feet above sea level. There was no shelter except the broken fuselage. No food except what the passengers had brought with them. No working radio. No way to call for help. But the survivors believed rescue would come. It had to. The plane had disappeared. People would be looking for them. They just had to wait. So they waited. The first night was brutal. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. The survivors squeezed themselves into the fuselage to stay warm. People wrapped themselves in whatever clothing they had. They pressed together, anything to preserve body heat. The next morning, they expected to hear aircraft. Nothing. They waited again. Still nothing. Then the days started passing. Search planes flew over the mountains. But the white fuselage was almost impossible to see against the snow. The survivors could sometimes hear aircraft above them. They would rush outside, wave, shout, try anything they could, but the planes never saw them. And eventually, the search stopped. The survivors didn't know that at first. They assumed rescue teams were still searching. They assumed someone would eventually find them. But as the days passed, it became obvious that something was wrong. There was almost nothing to eat. They had some chocolate, some wine, a few pieces of food, but those supplies disappeared quickly. The mountains didn't provide anything. No plants, no animals they could easily catch, no farms, no villages, nothing. Eventually, they ran out of food, completely. They started eating the leather from luggage straps. Anything that might provide even a tiny amount of nutrition. But it wasn't enough. Their bodies were starving. Then an avalanche hit. During the night, snow poured into the fuselage. The survivors woke up buried. Several people died. Others were injured. The shelter they'd been relying on was now partially buried. And suddenly, the survivors weren't just starving. They were running out of oxygen. They dug themselves out, but the situation had become almost impossible. They were trapped in the Andes. The rescue effort had ended. Food was gone, temperatures were deadly, and there was no way to leave. At this point, some of the survivors began discussing something they had been terrified to even consider. The bodies. They had no food. They had no animals to hunt. They had no plants. And they were surrounded by the bodies of people who had died in the crash. It was an unthinkable decision, but they were starving, and eventually, they chose survival. They began using the bodies of those who had died as food. It wasn't easy. Many survivors struggled with the decision. Some refused at first. Others couldn't bring themselves to participate. But eventually, hunger became stronger than almost everything else. They weren't eating because they wanted to. They were eating because they believed that without it, they would die. And still, they had no idea whether rescue would ever come. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The survivors grew weaker. Some died from their injuries. Others died from exposure. Some simply couldn't survive the conditions. Eventually, only a fraction of the original group remained, and they began thinking about something even more dangerous. If nobody was coming, they would have to go looking for help. Two men eventually emerged as the people willing to make that attempt: Nando Pardo and Roberto Canessa. Their plan was simple: walk. The problem? They had absolutely no idea how far they would have to go. They knew there had to be civilization somewhere beyond the mountains. But the Andes weren't a normal mountain range. They were enormous, steep, cold, and incredibly difficult to cross. still, staying behind meant certain death. So they left. They climbed. And climbed. And climbed. For days, they moved through the mountains. They were exhausted. Their food was limited. Their clothing was inadequate. Their bodies were already weakened by weeks of starvation. But they continued. At one point, they reached a ridge and looked out across the landscape. They expected to see a valley, maybe a road, maybe buildings, maybe civilization. Instead, they saw mountains, more mountains, stretching farther than they could see. For a moment, they realized something terrifying. They might have been walking in the wrong direction, but they kept going. Eventually, they found a river, and near that river, they found evidence that people were nearby. They found a can, then some other signs of human activity, and eventually, they saw a man on horseback. Nando and Roberto tried to communicate with him, but the river was too loud. The distance was too great. So Nando found a piece of paper. He wrote a message, wrapped it around a stone, and threw it across the river. The man picked it up, read it, and finally understood. There were survivors. People were still alive. The man was a Chilean muleteer named Sergio Catalan. He immediately went for help. Rescue teams were finally mobilized. After more than 2 months in the mountains, someone knew exactly where the survivors were. Helicopters were sent into the Andes, and when they finally reached the crash site, they found the remaining survivors. They were rescued. Of the 45 people who had originally been on the plane, 16 survived. They had spent 72 days trapped in the mountains. 72 days, at more than 11,000 feet, in freezing temperatures, with almost no food, after an avalanche, after losing friends, after watching rescue efforts stop, and after being forced to make one of the most morally difficult decisions imaginable. When the survivors finally returned to civilization, the world was shocked by what had happened. The story became international news, and the decision to eat the dead became one of the most controversial parts of the entire disaster. But the survivors explained something important. They weren't monsters. They weren't celebrating what they'd done. They were starving, and they believed that the people who had died would have wanted them to survive. Years later, many of the survivors continued living normal lives. They got married, had children, built careers, and somehow went on. But imagine what it must have been like to return home after 72 days in the Andes. To walk into a warm house, see a refrigerator full of food, turn on a light, open a door, take a shower. Things that had been completely ordinary before the crash must have felt extraordinary. The Andes disaster remains one of the most extraordinary survival stories ever documented, because surviving the crash wasn't enough. They had to survive the cold, the starvation, the avalanche, the isolation, and finally, the journey out. The people on Flight 571 thought they were simply taking a short flight to Chile. Instead, they found themselves stranded on top of the world, and for 72 days, they had no idea if anyone was coming. Eventually, 2 men decided that waiting wasn't enough. They walked into the mountains with almost nothing. They didn't know where civilization was. They didn't know if they'd make it. They simply knew that staying behind meant dying. So they kept walking, and eventually, they found a man on horseback. That single encounter saved the lives of everyone who remained, because sometimes survival doesn't come from being rescued. Sometimes you have to walk far enough to find the rescue yourself.